Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Right, so we are continuing with what we were discussing last lesson. So remember, we were finishing off on zakat. Discussion was with regards to giving your zakat to someone, but are you allowed to give more than the nisab? So we said that you are permitted to give more than the nisab. However, it's considered to be makruh. And the reason was because we said because you're making them rich, and then therefore potentially they could become themselves people who are necessary to give the zakat. Okay, so now we say وَيُكْرَهُ نَقْلُ الزَّكَاةِ مِنْ بَلَدٍ إِلَى بَلَدٍ. So it's considered to be makruh to transfer zakat from one part of the world to another part of the world. Yeah, so yukrahu naqlu zakati. So basically what this means is is that if you're living in the UK, then you should be giving your zakat in the UK. People who are in your city, people who are in your country, localized zakat, it should circulate amongst the people themselves. And it's considered to be makruh to give your zakat outside of your locality, outside of your country or outside of your area. Yeah, so this is considered to be something which is makruh. Now why is this for? So إنما تفرق صدقة كل فريق فيهم. So the sadaqah of every group of people should be distributed amongst the community. So the people, let's say for example, who are living in Birmingham, their zakat should be distributed amongst the people of Birmingham. And the people who are living in London should be distributed amongst the people of London. People of the UK, in the UK, people of Saudi Arabia should be distributed amongst them, Yemen, etc. All these places should be given. However, it's not, if a person was to give it, it would be done. And the reason, the argument for this is because the Quran simply says, إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ. And in usul fiqh, there's a principle which is that al-mutlaq yajri ala itlaqihi. Yeah, so because the ayah is a mutlaq ayah, then we leave it as that. We say this ayah is considered to be unconditioned, unrestricted. It's al-faqir is mutlaq al-faqir, any faqir. So you can give it to a faqir in the UK, in Australia, anywhere, so long as you've given it to someone, then it's fine. However, naqlu zakat from one country to another country is wrong because he says sadaqah should be given to each people lima rawayna, because of the hadith of Mu'adh radiallahu anhu. What is the hadith of Mu'adh? So we mentioned this last time as well. The Prophet ﷺ, when he sent Mu'adh radiallahu anhu, he said that zakat should be tu'khadh min aghniyaihim wa turaddu ila fuqara'ihim. Yeah, so taken from their rich and then given back to their poor. Now, some people have criticized this and said, well, that dhamir, so if you look at this hashi over here, so he says, بَعَثَ مُعَاذًا رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ إِلَى الْيَمَنِ وَفِيهِ فَأَعْلِمْهُمْ. So give them knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has افترض عليهم صدقة في أموالهم, has made obligatory upon them charity in their wealth. تؤخذ من أغنيائهم, is taken from their rich and ترد الفقراء. So this dhamir, him, this explanation that I've just done from Hidayah is based upon the idea that the hum goes back to the locality. So تؤخذ من أغنيائهم, i.e. the locality of people of Yemen. وترد على فقرائهم, and it's given back to their fuqara. However, some have argued that this isn't necessarily a strong argument, because one can say that the hum actually is referring to the Muslims. Yeah, تؤخذ من أغنياء المسلمين وترد على فقراء المسلمين. Yeah, and then there'd be no sort of like issue over there. So this is why this is considered to be something which is potentially has ihtimal of both. Anyway, he says, لما روينا من حديث معاذ رضي الله عنه فيه رعاية حق الجوار. And he says, another rational argument is رعاية حق الجوار, is consideration of the rights of the neighbors. Yeah, so this, although this has got no direct link to zakat, this is just a general principle in Islam, which is Islam encourages people to take care of their neighbors, آتِ ذَا الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى, and then الجار بالجنب والجار جار الجنوب والجار ذي القربى. So you have the neighbors, you have the ones that are very close to you, etc. There's a lot of emphasis on giving your money, your zakat to your close neighbors as well. That's the idea of this. Also, there's also other evidences that some of the scholars have presented as well. Like, for example, where Mu'adh radiallahu anhu, in the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, he distributed the zakat and then he came to Umar with 1/3 of it left. So 2/3 of the zakat was distributed, 1/3 of the zakat was left, meaning there was no more poor people to give it to. So he brought it to Medina, and Umar radiallahu anhu said that, what's this? Are you supposed to distribute it amongst your people? He goes, yeah, there's no one left now. So he goes, okay, so he took it. And then like that, the next year, 1/3 of it was distributed, 2/3 of it was left. So he took it to Medina. And then they say in the next year, there was no one to give zakat to in Yemen. The point is that if you look historically, zakat was distributed locally. Now, some people can argue that, is this possibly the case that in the past, it was logistically, it was very difficult to transfer gold and silver, basically zakat, from one part of the world to another part of the world. And it was dangerous because there could be a very high possibility of theft and something happening on the way. So that's why it made more sense to immediately, as soon as you can, take the zakat and distribute it amongst the local people. So that's why in our days today, now for us, it's very, very easy to be able to transfer money from one part of the world to another. It doesn't really take that much time as well. That's why he says, إِلَّا أَن يَنْقُلَهَا الْإِنسَانِ إِلَى قَرَابَتِهِ, unless a person transfers it to their qaraba, their close relatives. أو إلى قوم هم أحوج من أهل بلده, or he transfers it to a group of people outside of his community who are more in need of it than the people of his country. So he's given exemption. The mustathna is 2. Yeah, so in other words, zakat should be distributed amongst the local people unless you're giving your zakat to close relatives that live abroad. So if your close relatives live abroad, then it's better to give it to them. And likewise, if you're going to be giving zakat to people who are in more need of you, then it's better to give it to them rather than your local people. So there seems to be 2 sort of like illas: qaraba, close kin, and the second is a more pressing need abroad. Yeah. So then, if these 2 things, one of these 2 things is found, then giving your zakat abroad is not makruh. Then it's not considered makruh. Now, besides this, scholars have mentioned other reasons as well, but we'll look into that in a bit in Bahr al-Raiq. He says, لِمَا فِيهِ مِنَ الصِّلَةِ. So the reason why giving it to your relatives who are abroad. So let's say you live in the UK and you've got relatives that live in Somalia, or you've got relatives that live in Bangladesh or in Pakistan, and you want to give your zakat to your relatives over there. That's totally fine. In fact, that's silatul rahim. And silatul rahim is just like we talked about the jiwar, haqq al-jiwar. There's also this concept of silatul rahim. So the Hanafis, in their fiqh, they're trying to reconcile between various sort of like hadith and ayats of the Quran. So Quran time and time again talks about the haqq of your jiwar, yeah, al-jar, and it talks about the haqq of your relatives, silatul rahim, and hadith talk about it as well. So they're saying basically when it comes to all of the ibadat, zakat is the one where you are financially supporting another individual, and if you financially support your close kin, that is in fact something which is like double reward, because one is you're giving your zakat, and secondly you're supporting one of your close kin, so you're doing something which is, that's one. And the second, أو زيادة دفع الحاجة, or there is extra removal of need, meaning that if you give your zakat to people who are in more need of your zakat than you or than your community, then this is actually something which is better because you're removing more of a need. So let's say, for example, in the UK there are poor people, but let's say, for example, they've got like 20% need. And maybe in Yemen, maybe there's like they've got 60-70% need. So 60-70% need is greater than 20% need. So it's saying, oh, ziyadatu daf'i al-hajati. Now, one of the arguments that's raised about this was something that National Zakat Foundation initially they had this campaign, which was, give your zakat locally. You should give your zakat locally. They're really pressing for the local zakat. And one of the arguments that was raised was that giving your zakat locally or giving your zakat abroad, how do you measure who is in more of a need? Because need is also considered to be something that's relative. Like, for example, there might be a family that's living in Yemen, and there's a family that's living in the UK. And the family that's living in Yemen, the amount they need to survive is going to be much less than the amount that's needed by a family in the UK. But both are poor. So the family that's living in the UK, for example, might find it difficult to be able to buy groceries for the family to eat. Might find it difficult to pay for tuition or for medicines, or might find it difficult to be able to pay for bus fare, all these things. So when we say that someone is greater in hajah, this is a very difficult thing to be able to precisely measure between two different countries when the demographics of one part of the world is very different from the demographics of another part of the world. Yeah. So this is again like an issue. But the theory is there. The theory is that if there's people out there who are clearly more in need of the people of your local community, then it makes sense to, it's permissible. It's not necessary to give your zakat over there, but it won't be makruh to give your zakat over there, right? So that's the issue here. However, if you do give your zakat locally, then you've got the haqq al-jiwar. You still got that concept over there. Okay, then he says, وَلَوْ نُقِلَ إِلَى غَيْرِهِمْ أَجْزَأَهُ. And if a person was to give their zakat to other than them, right? So in other words, let's say a person doesn't give it to their relatives abroad and doesn't give it to people who are in more of a need than your local community. Will the zakat be done? So he says, yes, it'll be done. Yeah, and we mentioned why. Yeah, it'll be done because it's mutlaq. وَإِن كَانَ مَكْرُوهًا, even though it's counted as makruh. Now, some of the Hanafis have said that the karahat over here, like Ibn Abidin rahimahullah in his commentary on Bahr Ra'iq, it's called Minhatul Khaliq, he says that the karahat seems to be makruh tanzihi. It's not a makruh tahrimi issue. Because there isn't for it to be makruh tahrimi, there has to be some categorical prohibition or at least a very strong prohibition from the Sharia to say don't give your money abroad. Yeah, but there isn't anything. It's just based upon the idea of, the hadith of Mu'adh, which in fact in itself there doesn't seem to be a nahi in there. So this is again another thing in fiqh we have to be very careful of. When karahat is mentioned, generally the karahat is makruh tahrimi, otherwise it's makruh tanzihi. But when can something be makruh tahrimi? The evidence has to be quite clear about what it's saying. Now, why is this for? Why is it permissible to actually give it abroad? He says, لأن المصرف, because the masraf of zakat is mutlaq al-fuqara. Yeah, is just fuqara in and of itself, as in unconditioned fuqara. Bin nassi, according to the Quranic text. Yeah, and the Quranic text is إنما الصدقات للفقراء. So Allah doesn't say إنما الصدقات لفقراء بلادكم. Yeah, your local people know. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, now here this is where scholars now discuss other masail as well in relation to this concept of giving abroad. So what I'm going to do is one of the best discussions I've actually found is in Bahr Ra'iq. It's also in Ibn Abidin. Yeah, but Bahr Ra'iq has it mentioned. Actually, you know what? We'll just look in Ibn Abidin, save time instead of having to go to all those. Okay, so let's see what he says. All right. So he says, وَكُرِهَ نَقْلُهَا إِلَّا إِلَى قَرَابَةٍ أَوْ أَحْوَجَ So this is Tumurtashi's text. أو أصلح أو أورع أو أنفع للمسلمين. So he's added some extra ones in here. Right, so Hidayah has only mentioned two mustathnas. He's actually added some more, three more. So let's have a read of this then. It is Kuriha is considered makruh to transfer your zakat abroad except to close kin. بل في الظهيرية in ظهيرية it says لا تقبل صدقة الرجل وقرابته محاوج. In fact, a man's, some Hanafis are saying this now, by the way. A man's zakat is not permitted, especially when he has close kin that are in need, حتى يبدأ بهم, until he starts the zakat with them. As in, if you have zakat, if you have close kin abroad that are in need, and you're not giving your zakat to them, you're giving it locally, then your zakat isn't done. That's what he's saying. فَيَصُدَّ حَاجَتَهُم, and then he starts with them, and then he fulfills their need. Right. So, again, is this the argument that the later Hanafis have taken or not? And that's something else. Number two, or ahwaj, or the person is considered to be more ahwaj. Yeah. So more ahwaj meaning that there's more need of it. Or aslah, aslah meaning that it is more beneficial to give it to the local community. Yeah, there's more. It's like there is more sort of like interest in the local community. Or awra, or the person that you're giving it to is actually has more wara, as in it's like a pious individual, a scholar, student of knowledge locally, right? You wanna kind of give your zakat to them because clearly, if it's a pious person, you're kind of supporting Islam at the same time as well, because you're supporting his piety and supporting his good acts in the community. Or anfa' lil muslimin, or if there is a greater benefit in there for the Muslimin, yeah. And then rather than giving it to your local community, you give it abroad. So these are five reasons that he's mentioned. So number one is the first two are the ones that we mentioned in Hidayah, and the third one is aslah, awra, or anfa' lil muslimin. And then he carries on and says, "O min dar al harbi ila dar al Islam." Yeah. Or number 6 now. If a person gives their zakat, they're living in Dar al-Harb, and they don't give their zakat in Dar al-Harb, but they send it to a Muslim country. Or ila talib al-ilm, or they send they give their zakat to a student of knowledge. Yeah, so a student of knowledge is given the zakat. The student of knowledge lives abroad. Let's say he lives in Morocco or in Egypt or somewhere else, and it's sending the zakat to him. وفي المعراج التصدق على العالم الفقير أفضل. And some Hanafis have even said giving your zakat to a poor scholar of Islam is actually better. And see what the Hanafis are doing. They're looking at this concept of what is the benefit of the student of knowledge? Like, what role does he play in the community long term? Clearly, he's going to become an alim. He's going to, disseminate the knowledge. So that's another thing that the Hanafis look at. And if you remember when we discussed about giving zakat to the ghani, we said you're allowed to give zakat to a amil even though he's ghani, because the idea is his zakat is not because he's poor. It's actually because he's doing the job. He's doing the job of distributing the zakat. And another one the Hanafis have added to that is the student of knowledge. And some of the Hanafis said even if the student of knowledge is rich, he can still receive zakat because he has literally given himself up for the studies. That's what he's done. He's kind of given himself up for studies and he can't work. So it's like, what do? We either don't give him the zakat and let him sort of like struggle in trying to use up his money reserve, or we say fine, he's rich, but in this case supporting him is the better. Yeah. So this is why he says O ila az-zuhad. Okay, so this is 7, 8, 9, right? So this is 7, 8, and then 9, number 9. O ila az-zuhad, to people, ascetics, people who are like pious people of the community who are sort of like away, distance themselves from materialistic things. Or kanat mu'ajjalatan, or a person gives their zakat before its time. So if you remember, we said you're allowed to give your zakat in advance, right? So you give it in advance, that's totally fine. So mu'ajjalatan qabla tamam al-hawl, before the 12 months is up. Fala yukrahu, then it's no problem. And this is in the book Khulasa. Yeah. So again, so here, if you kind of, if you just go down to the hashia and look at, okay, okay, here is, you know that when he said the issue of if you don't give it to your qaraba who are in greater need, then your zakat is not accepted. So Imam Ibn Abdin wants to clarify this and say, well, this is not really, don't take this literally. Yeah, because he says, والمراد بعدم القبول عدم الإثابة. He won't get reward عليها وإن سقط بالفرض, even though the obligation will be absolved, discharged. لأن المقصود منها سد خلة المحتاج, because the idea of giving zakat is fulfilling the need of a poor person. And في القريب جمع بين الصلة والصدقة, and then he goes into that issue. Okay, and then over here where he says, والأفضل, and it's better to give it to brothers first and sisters, then to give it to their children, nephews and nieces, then paternal uncles, paternal aunties, then to maternal aunties, maternal uncles, then to the outer circles of your relatives. ثم جيرانه, and then neighbors. ثم أهل السكة, then the people who live on that same road. ثم أهل بلده, and then the people of the same town or city, place. So he kind of like breaks it down of who you should give it to. Now this Dar al-Harb one is interesting because he says لأن فقراء المسلمين, so when you're living in Dar al-Harb, you can send your money to the Islamic country, you don't have to distribute it in Dar al-Harb. So he says لأن فقراء المسلمين الذين في دار الإسلام, because the poor people living in Dar al-Islam are better من فقراء دار الحرب. That's the argument. Better as in, now this does not mean they are better in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather it's saying that they are better because the system that they have in the Dar al-Islam is going to be more conducive to Islam, rather than giving it to the poor people in Dar al-Harb, right? Where technically the Muslims should not be living in Dar al-Harb. That's the idea. They shouldn't be permanently living in Dar al-Harb. It should be for people who are in Dar al-Islam. قلت ينبغي استثناء أساري المسلمين. He says, then you should make an exemption of the captives, the Muslim captives in Dar al-Harb. So Muslims who have been captured and are now living in Dar al-Harb. إذا كان في دفعها إعانة, if there is, by giving the zakat, there is a support of freeing them من رقاب الأسر. So if you remember quite a few lessons ago when I showed you in tafsir of Alusi, that or fir riqab, and I said to you that some of the scholars actually said fir riqab can also be used for freeing captives, although generally it's understood as being providing the mukatab, giving the mukatab the zakat so that he can free himself, but it's also used for this. So this is an indication towards that. Okay. Anyway, so that's something which, and then you can read the rest of it yourself, like this section where it says, a person should not give their zakat to the people of bid'ah, innovators, because again, you don't want to support this innovation with their practice, etc. But your zakat will be done if you give it to poor people. That's the argument. Okay, right. I wanted to mention the thing, but he didn't mention it in. So Bahar Raik. Let me just. Okay. Anyway, we'll. Yeah, we'll leave that one. We'll go back to this then. Okay, so next. Babu Sadaqatil Fitr. Yeah, so this is now the chapter of Sadaqatul Fitr now. So Sadaqatul Fitr, Sadaqa means obviously zakat, and Fitr is referring to the ending of Ramadan. Yeah, so Fitr means like to eat, and it also is a word that's used for. It's a word that's used for not fasting. Now, some of the scholars have done a discussion, like in Binaya. If you read Binaya, you'll find a discussion of some of the scholars with regards to this word fitr. Is it an Islamic word, or is it something that has been there since Jahiliyyah, as in have they been using it? So just the khulas of everything that of he says is basically the word fitr was used by Arabs. There was the usage of fitr by the Arabs before Islam, of course. However, and even the Quran as well, like fitratullah allati fatara an-nas alayha. However, the specific meaning that the Muslims use, that's clearly something which Islam has come out with. This is what you call al-naql al-shar'i. So al-naql al-shar'i or al-urfi, where a word has a particular meaning in the past, and then when Islam came, Islam sort of like revamped that meaning. Right? It gave that meaning a particular specialization, you can almost say. It kind of specialized its meaning. Yeah, and there's I can't remember the term that they use for this word. What do they call it when words change their meaning? It's called I've forgotten now. Yeah, anyways. So it's basically where words can expand and contract in meaning. Yeah, so you have a particular word, it has a particular meaning at one time, and then as the time sort of like goes by, a particular word might change in meaning. So example is, for instance, like the word chip. So chip has, if you go back 100 years, you'll find that chip had a particular meaning. And then over time, as the time changed, the meaning of chip began to expand, or it began to shrink, contract, depending on the society. And same thing happened with a lot of words in Islam as well. So, for example, the word salat used to have a specific meaning, which was dua, or tahriku salawain, or even sitting near a fire, salah. But then when Islam came, Islam gave it a specific meaning in Islam. This is called naql al-shar'i, when the Sharia comes and it gives it a new specific sort of like meaning, and naql urfi as well. So Babu Sadaqat al-Fitr, chapter of the zakat of fitr. This is something which was legislated roughly around the first year of Hijrah. After the Prophet made Hijrah, roughly about the first year, Sadaqat al-Fitr, and it's a zakat that's given, and it's not the same as normal zakat. Normal zakat is based upon, ownership of mal, and then you have that mal for a year, and then you have to be aqil and baligh, and all those conditions, 7 conditions that we mentioned for that. Sadaqatul Fitr, on the other hand, is different. Sadaqatul Fitr is actually based upon ra'sun yamunuhu. Yeah, it's the illah. It kind of revolves, or the shart is ra'sun yamunuhu. This is what it revolves around. So that's why when it comes to Sadaqatul Fitr and zakat, normally in ahkam, like for example salat and fasting, you say the person has to have qudra. The person has to have qudra, which is the basic level of qudra. Yeah, the basic type of qudra you have to have. So meaning salamatul asbab. So for instance, like let's say I'm an adult, I'm sane, I'm Muslim. So when the time of salat comes now, I'm expected to pray salat. Why? Because I have the basic amount of qudra. And however, zakat is based upon qudra al-muyassara. You call this qudra muyassara. Qudra muyassara means there's extra conditions, there's extra sort of like shurut that are required in order for you to be eligible to give your zakat, right? Because it's to do with mal. So mal normally is something where it's difficult for people to earn it and then obviously having to give it. So that's why there needs to be extra conditions in there. Yeah. And the similar can be said for Hajj as well, with regards to Hajj. Like, you don't have the same conditions that you need for Salat, which is the basic 3. Muslim, Aqil, Baligh. But for Hajj, you need Muslim, Aqil, Baligh, and then you need, Salamatul Tariq. The journey there needs to be safe, and you also have to have Zad as well. Yeah. Man istata'a ilayhi sabila, as the Quran says. So Sadaqat al-Fitr actually comes under the basic. You just need the basic means, and then you have to give your zakat, sadaqah. So Sadaqatul Fitr wajibatun is necessary upon al-hur al-Muslim, upon a hur Muslim, إذا كان مالكا لمقدار النصاب, so long as the person he owns a nisab. So it's not like salat where you just need the three things. There is actually a few more points you need, but it's not the same as the zakat. You have to own the amount of nisab, and number five, fadilan and maskanihi, meaning not your hawaij asliya. So the wealth that you have has to be in excess of your house. So if you got a house, you don't have to take that into consideration. Your clothing, no. Your athath, your furniture, no. Your faras, your horse to ride, no. Silah, weapons, no. Abid, your slaves, no. Those are not considered when you're working out your zakat. It has to be in excess of these, right? So remember we said zakat is based upon malun nami, whereas sadaqat al-fitr is based upon any mal. It doesn't have to be nami, right? Even if you have, as long as excess, you have two cars, one that you use, one that you don't use. You wouldn't have to give zakat on the other car, but you have to give sadaqat al-fitr if you have another car, yeah, because this is considered to be beyond your hawaij, and it doesn't have to be mal nami, productive. Amma wujubuha, then he says, as for its obligation, فَلِقَوْلِهِ alayhi salam, because of the Prophet ﷺ's hadith, fi khutbatihi, in his khutbah, one day he said, أدوا عن كل حر وعبد صغير أو كبير, give on behalf of every free person and slave, whether it be minor or adult, نصف صاع, half a sa' of bur, wheat, or sa'an min tamr, or one sa' of dates, or one sa' of barley, sha'ir. Yeah, so this hadith, like if you look at this hadith, what we can tell from this hadith is clearly the conditions is different, because zakat you give on your own behalf for yourself, whereas in sadaqatul fitr you actually have to give zakat on behalf of other individuals as well. That's why I said in the beginning, this is on ra'sun yamunuhu. Ra's is a head, per head which you take care of, which is in your custody, in your care. So he says you have to give zakat on your own behalf and on behalf of every free and slave that you're in charge of, whether they be minor or whether they be kabir. Now, we're going to look at this a bit later. What does that mean, kabir? Does it mean if you have a son who's 20 years old, you have to give sadaqah al-fitr on their behalf? Not necessarily. He says, رواه ثعلبة ابن سعير العدوي. So this has been narrated by Tha'lab ibn Su'ayr al-Adawi. So he just basically mentioned that, who narrated. Normally he doesn't seem to mention the rawis when he quotes them. But for some reason over here he has quoted the hadith and the rawi as well. وَبِمِثْلِهِ يَثْبُتُ الْوُجُوبِ. Now he says, because this hadith is a khabar wahid, it's not a mashhur or mutawatir hadith, we can't use this hadith to establish fardiyat. We can't say sadaqat al-fitr is fard, yeah, because of the hadith is not at the level of qat'iyut thubut, qat'iyut dalala. Okay, so it's not categorical in establishment and categorical in clarity. So this is why he says, and with this wujub is established, li'adam al-qat'. Li'adam al-qat' means that the evidence is not categorical. It's not qat'i evidence, but you still have to give wujub. Now again, this is an important point as well, which is when Hanafis look at evidences, just like you guys have covered in usul, when Hanafis look at evidences are considered to be according to how they reach us and their meaning as well. So if evidence has reached us through a categorical transmission, which we call mutawatir or mashhur, then we say that this can establish level of fardiyat. Whereas if evidence is less than that, right, if it's reached us but through khabar wahid, then we say that it can establish wujub at best, nothing more. And if the text of the Quran or the hadith is unanimous in its meaning, no two scholars differ on its meaning, then we say this is qat'iyu dalala. Its inference, its signification, meaning is categorical. But if the hadith or the ayah of the Quran can hold two possible or more meanings, or two scholars have differed on its meaning, then we say that the level of the evidence now has gone down, and we say this is no longer qat'i, right? So what is the consequence of this? The consequences would be to do with aqidah, meaning if a person was to dismiss and reject a categorical evidence of the Quran or of the mutawatir mashhur hadith in which there is no ikhtilafin, then that person would be considered out of the fold of Islam. Hanafis differ on a one little point here, which is, does it have to be qat'iyu dalala, qat'iyu thubut? That's it. Or does it have to be something which is ma'lumun bid darura? It has to be known by all Muslims. So Ibn Abidin rahimullah seems to incline towards ma'lum bid darura. Ma'lum bid darura is the most important thing. So something can be categorical in the deen, but it's not known to everyone. Yeah, and therefore it cannot be a means for a person being called a kafir for rejecting it. Yeah. So this is why he says, وَبِمِثْلِهِ يَثْبُتُ الْوُجُوبِ لِعَدَمِ الْقَطْعِ. Yeah, because there is no qat'iyyat in there. Alright. Does everyone understand that, yeah? وَشَرَطَ الْحُرِّيَّةِ. Now he says Imam Quduri has conditioned hurriya. He said hur, yeah, al hur, ليتحقق التمليك. In order for tamlik to occur, meaning you have to be a free person, because if you're a slave, if you're opposite of free person, which is a slave, you don't have the power to give someone something. So giving someone something is a right of free people. Right? So making someone an owner, whether it's through gifting or whether it's through selling, that's a right of a free individual. Slaves don't have that right intrinsically. So that's why he says the reason why he said hur is in order for tamlik to be established. Yeah, because tamlik cannot be established through a slave. Well, Islam, so why did he say it has to be a Muslim? لِيَقَعَ قُرْبَةً, in order for the act to be counted as a qurba. So remember, I told you this before as well. So basically, ibadat, all ibadat have to be done with intention, right? An ibadah cannot be accepted without intention. So whether it's salat, whether it's zakat, fasting, hajj, etc., you have to have an intention that you're doing it for a higher cause, ultimately, in order for it to be counted as an act of ibadah. Alright, if you don't do that, for example, if a person just gave money to someone and they didn't do it with the intention of helping them or anything like that, then it won't be counted as a qurba, and therefore it can't be counted as an ibadah. And however, non-ibadah acts which are just general acts that people do, they are non-rewarded by default. So for example, let's say you eat food. Eating food, there's no reward in eating food, and there's no reward in going to sleep. But if you eat the food with the intention that you want to strengthen your body so that you could function properly to provide for your family or to worship Allah, then it becomes a qurba. And the same with sleep as well. You go to sleep because your body's tired and you want it to, replenish yourself so that next day you can worship Allah. It becomes a qurba. Yeah. So qurbas, you can have a normal adi, so practice, regular practice that you do that can become rewarding. Right? So this is why, according to majority of Hanafis, wudu is not an ibadah, because wudu is considered to be something that does not necessarily need an intention for it to be done. Yeah. So the intention part is for the salat itself, not for the wudu itself. This is why he says Sadaqatul Fitr is an ibadah, and it can only occur with qurba, and intention of closeness to Allah can only occur when a person has iman in their heart, is a Muslim. That's why he says the reason why we mention Muslim is because of this. Now, he hasn't said over here he has to be sane, but that would be something that we would understand. You have to be sane, and the reason you have to be sane is because, a person who is insane, the ahkam taklif, the ahkam cannot apply to them. Okay, he says, well, yasar means richness, so إذا ملك, إذا كان مالكا, all that. So yasar, the reason why he says yasar, rich, is because of the Prophet ﷺ saying, لا صدقة إلا عن ظهر غني, yeah, or ظهر غني. So sadaqah is not valid except when a person is rich. Yeah, so in other words, a person has to be rich. So ظهر غني means like the back of a rich person, a back that's rich, meaning a person has to be rich in order. Therefore, a person who is not rich does not have to give sadaqah, as in no zakat. So that's a general statement which is inclusive of zakat and inclusive of sadaqah al-fitr as well. Okay. وَهُوَ حُجَّةٌ عَلَى الشَّافِي. Then he says, this hadith is actually evidence against Imam Shafi, because Imam Shafi, he says, يَجِبُ عَلَى مَنْ يَمْلِكُ زِيَادَةً عَنْ قُوتِ يَوْمِهِ لِنَفْسِهِ وَعِيَالِهِ. That sadaqatul fitr is necessary upon an individual who possesses more than what they need for their daily, their daily food, for themselves and for their dependents. So let's say, for example, let's say I've got children and I've got a spouse and I'm taking care of them. So as long as I've got enough to be able to provide for for that one day for my spouse, for my children, then I would say that I have to give sadaqah, even if it's below the nisab. So that's the difference between the Hanafis and the Shafis. Shafis say, so let's say nisab is 350 pounds. Hanafis would say you would have to have more than 350 pounds for you to give sadaqah al-fitr. Shafis say no, even if you had 100 pounds, you'd have to give sadaqah al-fitr. Yeah, because you clearly would have enough to provide for yourself for that particular day and for your family, and that's it. So this is why we say that hadith is actually evidence against Imam Shafi on this. وَقَدَّرَ الْيَسَارِ بِالنِّصَابِ. Yeah, and Imam Quduri, he measures yasar, richness, with nisab. We talked about this last week, if you remember. We said, how is it possible? Why do we have to have this idea of nisab? Because we said, technically, zakat is given to someone who is in need. Now, need is something which is difficult to be able to demarcate, to be able to exactly define. So what do? So we say, okay, we go to the sabab of haja, which is the nisab. So the nisab is an identifying marker that tells us this person is in need. So he says, وَقَدَّرْ الْيَسَارِ بِالنِّصَابِ لِتُقَدَّرْ الْغِنَى فِي الشَّرْءِ بِهِ, because ghina is measured في الشرع به, by it. Yeah. So ghina in the Sharia is measured by it, meaning generally the Sharia seems to stipulate the nisabs as being the marker for richness. فاضلا عما ذكر من الأشياء, and this mal has to be in excess of those things that he mentioned, like your clothes and your furniture and your all those things. Yeah, what we call the hawaij asliya. Why is that for? He says لأنها مستحقة بالحاجة الأصلية, because these things are needed. مستحقة is needed بالحاجة الأصلية. Yeah, so the default haja. So like we said, the default haja is what? Is anything that a person requires in order for them to be able to function in the day. The basic things that a person requires for a person to be able to function, we call this the hajat al-asliya. So if you have hajat al-asliya, then that means you've got everything you need. And then anything besides that, وَالْمُسْتَحَقُّ بِالْحَاجَةِ الْأَصْلِيَةِ كَالْمَعْدُومِ. Yeah, so anything that is needed بِالْحَاجَةِ الْأَصْلِيَةِ, it's like it doesn't exist. So let's say, for example, I've got a car. The car is my hajat al-asliya. If that car is needed by me, that means from a Shari point of view, it's as though I do not have that car. As in, I don't have mal. Yeah, so the Sharia would consider that to be like almost, you can say, like a non-existent asset that I have from a zakat point of view. So he says, mustahaqqu bil hajati, anything that is needed through hajat al-asliya, is treated as though it is ma'doom. وَلَا يُشْتَرَطْ فِيهِ النُّمُو. Now if someone argues, do you have to have the same condition of productivity for zakat? In zakat we said, it not only has to be beyond your hajat al-asliya, it also has to be one of the 7 things that we mentioned. Yeah, camels and goats and cows and gold and silver, etc. All those things. So does it have to be one of those? We said no. لا يشترط فيه النمو. It does not have to be productive as well. So if I've got 2 cars, and one car I drive and one car sometimes I drive, but it's not really hajat al-asliya, it's not needed, then therefore I have to give Sadaqa al-fitr, because I work out the value of the car. وَيَتَعَلَّقُ بِهَذَا النِّصَابِ حِرْمَانُ صَدَقَةٍ, and with this nisab is attached. So with this nisab is attached حِرْمَانُ صَدَقَةٍ, where sadaqah becomes haram upon a person, and meaning they can't take. So in other words, if you remember last week when we mentioned about the giving your zakat to someone who's in need, we said that they have to be below the nisab, but not only below the nisab, they also have to have wealth which is not in excess of the hajat al asliya. Yeah. So this is what he's saying here. He's saying this nisab calculation that we've just mentioned over here, this is the nisab which will result in a person not being allowed to receive zakat, hirman or sadaqah. Number two, wujub al-udhiyah, and a person would have to, if it was Eid al-Adha, they would have to actually slaughter a goat or 1/7 of a cow, and fitra, and they'd have to give sadaqah al-fitr. Yeah, so these are three things that you can say are a result of this. Now, if you go to the hashi over here, I just want to read this and then we'll finish. He says, وَلَا يُشْتَرَطْ فِيهِ النُّمُو. So the mal does not have to be productive. لأنها تجب بالقدرة الممكنة. So remember, there are two types of qudra. ممكنة is basic qudra. ميسرة is qudra which requires extra conditions. Yeah. So zakat is a qudra muyassara and salat is a qudra mumakkina. So he says, ألا ترى أنها تجب, don't you see that sadaqat al-fitr is necessary upon any person who owns a nisab min thiyab al-bidla. So if you've got like lots of pairs of clothes at home, which are beyond your normal hajat al-asliya, you have to give zakat on it if the value of those clothes works out to be more than £350, for example. Ma yusawi mi'atay dirham, that those clothes or those those clothes that you wear which are equal to 200 dirhams fadlan, in excess of the hajat al-asliya. فلا يتحقق النماء, so therefore nama is not found بثياب البذلة, in clothing that are worn. ولهذا لا تسقط عنه الفطرة, that's why sadaqat al-fitr is not dropped from this individual. إذا حلق المال, when the mal perishes, بعد الوجوب, after obligation. So let's say on Eid day, after Fajr you had all of this and then your mal got destroyed in a fire, you still have to give zakat, sadaqat al-fitr rather. Whereas remember zakat, when we said if your mal gets destroyed, istihsanan, it will also decrease from the zakat that you have to give. So anyway, he says, so بخلاف الزكاة فإن وجوبها, because the obligation zakat is قدرة ميسرة, فيشترط في النصاب النماء, and that's why in zakat of nisab you need nama, productivity, لتحقق اليسر, in order for ease to be found. ولهذا إذا هلك المال, and then he goes that if mal of zakat was to become destroyed, it drops from the zakat. Okay, last hashia. He says ويتعلق بهذا النصاب, and with this nisab is attached, يشير إلى وجوب النصب. Yeah, قيل وهي ثلاثة. There's three types of nisabs. نصاب يشترط فيه النماء. There's one type of nisab where you need productivity in order for it to become obligatory. تتعلق به زكاة. Zakat is attached to this. وسائل الأحكام, and all the rest of those hukms, those ahkam, المتعلقة بالمال, which are associated to mal. ونصاب, number two, نصاب يجب به أربعة أحكام أربعة. And there's some nisabs where 4 ahkam become necessary. حرمة الصدقة, they can't receive sadaqah. وجوب الأضحية, صدقة الفطر, and نفقات الأقارب. So he mentioned the 4th one, which is you have to spend on close kin if they're very poor. Yeah. ولا يشترط فيه النماء. In this type of nisab, you don't need productivity. You just need to have more than the nisab and more than your hajat al-asliya. لا بالتجارة ولا بالحول. Yeah, so not due to tijara, nor the 1 year passing. وَنِصَابٌ, and number 3, the third nisab is يَثْبُتُ بِحُرْمَةُ السُّؤَال. This is the nisab by which it's haram for a person to beg. You can't go out begging. وَهُوَ مَا إِذَا كَانَ, and this is when a person has with them قُوتُ يَوْمِهِ, the amount of provisions for 1 day. According to some, and some say he has approximately 50 dirhams. Yeah, 50 dirhams or its equivalent. Okay, so these are some of the things that he mentioned over here. Now, what I would suggest is for Sadaqat al-Fitr, try to read for next lesson. Try to read Badai al-Sanai if you can. Yeah, and Bahr al-Ra'iq. These are 2 that I would definitely recommend for you to read If you read one of them, it doesn't matter. It's good. Yeah, if you read both of them, it's better. And there's a book which I'll put up onto the Hidayah class. Yeah, and this is a book written by Mustafa Ahmad Zarqa. Yeah, so Mustafa Zarqa, he was a Jordanian Hanafi, and he has written a book on the concept of certain things in Sharia where aql plays an important role. And the reason for that is because next week or the coming lessons, we're going to be discussing about this issue of um, if these three things have been mentioned by the Prophet ﷺ, or four in some narrations, which is half a sa of wheat, and then one sa of either dates, one sa of barley, one sa of raisins. If that has been mentioned that you have to give this, then is it permissible to give their value or not? So this was like a something that Hanafis were, Abu Hanifa rahimahullah specifically was criticized for, that he was using values. In the hadith doesn't mention values, it mentions those specific foodstuffs. And so that book is a very good book that sort of like explains that concept. Okay, right, so just to summarize what we did, if you've got any questions, you can put them in the comments below. So he says, so we're talking about the transporting zakat outside of your community. Are you allowed to transport your zakat outside your community? We said it's considered to be makruh tanzihi to do so. However, it's not considered to be something which is prohibited. Yeah, it's not considered prohibited. The reason for this is because of the hadith of Mu'adh radiallahu anhu. If, however, a person was to transport it to outside of the community for some valid reason, and Imam Quduri gives two reasons. Yeah, so you got relatives living abroad, or you've got people who are in greater need than the locals, then you give it. And we mentioned, altogether about 9 of the reasons in Radd al-Muhtar. Yeah, so the idea is basically, first and foremost, the Haqqul Jawar comes first. But if there is a greater need that outstrips the need of the Haqqul Jawar, then you give it to them. That's the idea. Then we talk about Sadaqa al-Fitr, which is Sadaqa al-Fitr is different from Zakat, because Sadaqa al-Fitr is actually something which is based upon the basic qudra that you have to have. Yeah, whereas Zakat is based upon qudra muyassara. And then we said that this is considered to be something which you have to own mal, because the idea is you have to be rich, and it has to be more than your hajat al-asliya. Yeah. Okay, and that's it. Stop there. Okay, guys. Jazakumullah khair. See you next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.